Let's see here. Richard Fogel, a noted literary scholar at Tulane, was once asked about John Milton, whom he described as perhaps the last of the Renaissance men. Milton, he noted, commanded a knowledge of Greek, Latin, Italian, and French. He was thoroughly learned in theology and philosophy. He possessed a comprehension of science that surpassed his contemporaries and at least equaled that of other great intellectuals of the past. And of course, John Milton also wrote and published poetry. One wonders what Fogel would have thought about the intellectual formation of our speaker tonight, Stephen Utz. At age 5, Utz expressed a desire to learn German, so his pastor gave him lessons, and he mastered it. In his youth, he also learned French at a Benedictine monastery here in Louisiana, and today, when he's invited to speak in France, he delivers his lectures in fluent French. He learned to play the organ at that same monastery at the direction of the abbot. During his undergraduate education at LSU, Stephen Utz was a stellar student in mathematics, physics, history, and philosophy, all when he was about 15. The last of these disciplines, philosophy, was his major and his passion. His distinguished undergraduate work won him a scholarship to study at Cambridge University in England, where he earned his doctorate in the field of philosophy. But he cheated a little, spending much of his time there indulging himself in the study of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, when he was supposed to be working on his dissertation. When Stephen Utz returned to LSU, administrators there had hoped to appoint him as the editor of the Southern Review. And at that time, he was teaching in the philosophy department, the youngest faculty member, in fact, to hold such a position there. Among many other things, he has published articles on literature, one of which caught the attention of famed literary critic Harold Bloom, who included the essay in one of his anthologies. And sadly, for those of us in the humanities anyway, Dr. Utz eventually turned his attention to the study of law. So it comes as no surprise, of course, that he has built a distinguished career in that field too. And since 1983, he's taught at the University of Connecticut's School of Law. I'm pleased to mention, however, that he too still writes and publishes poetry. It seems plain enough that Dr. Stephen Utz's career offers a robust challenge to the observation by Richard Fogel that I mentioned a little earlier, because clearly Renaissance men do indeed still exist in our time. And it's my honor tonight to introduce to you one of them that we have here tonight, Dr. Stephen Utz.
That was wildly generous, and I won't point out that it was inaccurate in a couple of respects, all of them paying compliments to me, so I can't argue with that. It's very, very kind. Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure, and I really have to say it's a gift to be invited to come here and speak tonight about Walker Percy, especially so because one of my predecessors, I believe, in the same series was Lewis Simpson, or was it a different series? Or
I didn't hear you what. It was similar. It was the Levy Lectures.
The Levy Lectures, okay. Who I think spoke around 10 years ago, and he was really a very close friend of Walker Percy. I wish I could claim the same for myself, but I'll tell you, I have this little minuscule sort of connection with our novelist of the night. I met him and shook his hand on many occasions, and he was a regular visitor at the at St. Joseph's Abbey near Covington, where he lived. I was a seminarian there when I was a teenager, and he came weekly there. We saw him quite often, and there was a small fan club for his works. I can say that a number of us as students had read the Moviegoer within 2 years of its appearance, so we were on the cutting edge, and that's the strength that's as good as my connection gets. Walker Percy was conspicuously a storyteller with an agenda. His narratives, however, were not allegories. That is to say, he didn't package preconceived messages in story form. An allegory is an artistic representation of a lesson or a proposition by means of events unrelated to that message. Examples include things like Spenser's Fairy Queen or Brecht's Good Person of Szechuan. If we think about it even for a moment, it's easy to recognize that when a narrative encodes a message, it of course makes that message a little less accessible. The path of discovery which might lead us to appreciate the actual but hidden content has nothing to do with the narrative. And the literary vehicle is an obstacle for the reader instead of an aid to getting to the point. It would perhaps, I won't say always, but sometimes it is better to skip the code-breaking exercise that keeps that solution at a distance. As Walter Benjamin put it, allegories are in the realm of thoughts what ruins are in the realm of things. Much that aspires to be philosophical literature, unfortunately, is allegorical. In contrast to allegory and to that sort of fixed and slavish repetition of statements, philosophy is really an activity. And it never boils down to a mere list of the outcomes of doing philosophy. Voltaire's Candide and Pope's Essay on Man should not be counted as philosophical works because they are just collections of aphorisms, with the window dressing of narrative in the case of Candide, or the window dressing of argument in the case of Pope. I do like both these works, and I'm not attempting to say that they are disqualified from achieving greatness as literature, but they just aren't philosophical. That is to say, they don't do what philosophy does. And so is it even possible for an artistic work to do something that is an activity of this kind, that belongs to the technical and discovery path of philosophy? Walker Percy, I'm convinced, had that aspiration. He wished to do that in literature. He worked to achieve it in several ways. His first two novels made magnificent efforts in this direction by portraying people who probed their environment for answers to big questions, and the books show us what they saw and what they did without spelling out their thought processes. Percy's obvious purpose in inventing this suggestive but inexplicit type of narrative is to allow the reader to connect the dots, so to speak, and have for herself the experience of the characters. In later novels, Love in the Ruins, Lancelot, the Thanatos Syndrome, he employs other devices, casting the novels as whodunits or as mysteries, though with a focus that includes a sort of crisis of knowledge beyond the immediate situations of the characters. And I'd like to say it carries over some of the techniques that he's used in The Moviegoer and in the Last Gentleman, which are more of the connect the dots variety of book. Many of Percy's characters in both the early and late novels are persistently baffled by things. They react by questioning almost everything, sometimes tentatively, but just as often insistently. Percy's development of these characters include much else to explain their investigative momentum, but the reflective and searching aspect of who they are, who the characters are, dominates everything else about them. Percy himself, in my view, gave them his own posture of epistemic confidence, wary of exaggeration and distraction. They're looking for truth that is also a resolution of crises in the world they live in, troubles rooted in contingent events that are nevertheless central to one's fleeting role as a human being. They sometimes describe their search as if it were simply a matter of looking carefully ahead and ticking off the details of what they see, but one is aware always of the pressure reality exerts on them. For example, at the beginning of The Moviegoer, Binks Bowling, the main character, casually tells us that he accepts and takes pleasure in the everydayness of life. And then he enumerates things that content him. Moviegoing, for of course, public transportation, his humdrum job, the unexotic look of Gentilly, the working class New Orleans neighborhood, and his small sexual exploits. But then he abruptly confides in the reader that he is a seeker. It began, he says, with his looking through his pockets. He found his wallet, notebook, pencil, keys, slide rule, and his comment was, "This made the search possible." Giving an example of how that search could be fulfilled, he tells how a young man lights a cigarette for Bill Holden, the actor, as both walk down Royal Street, and Holden gives the man and his apparently newlywed wife a pat on the shoulder. Binks, the hero, says, "He has won the title to his own existence." Repeatedly, Binks relies on the plots of movies and actors' personalities as more genuine than the events of daily life. He draws odd lessons from them, as if his own life were a mere shadow of theirs rather than the other way around. These beginning pages of the Moviegoer were really very troubling, and they make one uneasy, but they were a sort of epiphany in the literary world of the 1960s. The affectless Bink was a hybrid of the pathological and the comic, with striking literary parallels in Dostoevsky's Prince Mishkin and P.G. Woodhouse's Bertie Wooster. Binks's self-denying acceptance of the bland, his subordination to his bossy aunt, his lack of aspirations, were all deflationary of expectations. His mission in life, paradoxically, was to find in the plainest things possible the key to existence. This is beginning to sound rather far-fetched. The similarly unambitious Will Barrett in The Last Gentleman also suffers attacks of the itch for omniscience, for pure angelic knowledge. These are quotes. While his actions seem aimless and his relations with the Vaughts family, who figure large in the novel, are full of uncertainty. He takes pride, apparently, in being considered an engineer, although he acquires this title only because he works the night shift in the air conditioning department of a big department store. In another novel, Lancelot Andrews Lamar is, on the basis of similar urges, eager for knowledge and little else. Dr. Tom Moore, that's Thomas More, more constantly than any of these heroes in two separate novels, Love in the Ruins and Thanatos Syndrome, seeks to survey what is going on from an incredible intellectual height. So all of these are pretty pretentious main characters. Are these common symptoms among his heroes evidence that Walter Percy was a literary existentialist? His comments and interviews and non-fictional writings suggest that he accepted that label. The novels, of course, make it plausible. When we compare Percy's heroes with Dostoevsky's, Sartre's, Hermann Hesse's, Camus', Céline's, the kinship is at least notable. But what does it consist of, and what does it mean? What is existentialism? There is no single or simple definition. The nature of human beings, and perhaps of all conscious living things, is to be capable of getting to know themselves and their environment, and also to be capable of reflecting on how they know both themselves and their environment. Problematically, they, that is living things, and I mean, of course, we, are also part of that environment and are partly made who we are by it. But human beings are also capable of seeing beyond this highly contingent setting that both hems them in and enables them to go forward. We have a bifocal way of seeing, learning, and acting out. Traditional philosophy and other fields of learning had seemed to deny this, working to produce a flat screen version of reality. So which is it? Are we mainly subjects or objects? How can we truly come to be or truly understand ourselves? Understanding and being get scrambled, even posing this question. The struggle against that confusion has often been cast as a struggle against false consciousness, against all that is phony, and a struggle for the authentic, the real, perhaps for the cool and grunge. Interestingly, both technical philosophers and literary folk have been drawn to this quest. And you know which ones I'm talking about. I am talking about the existentialists. Some rather formal philosophical works that contributed to existentialism were critiques critiques of historiography and epistemology, Hegel, Croce, of received morality, Nietzsche, of religious belief, Kierkegaard, Karl Jaspers, of human psychological health is actually a whole literature of existentialist psychology. These were all skeptical critiques. They pushed back against or entirely rejected the goals early era theorists had thought uncontroversial. Existentialism in this realm embodied the new broom sweeps clean attitude. Skepticism in philosophy, and that's what existentialism represented, however, becomes old hat. Once you've said something, nothing is knowable, or that everything we thought we knew is false, the audience waits for you to put something in its place. Unable to do so, you quickly lose that audience. This is where the literary explorers of existentialism come and take the lead. They were able to do field work, so to speak, by showing readers factual patterns that gave a practical meaning to the problems of the theoretical, to the problems of existence, and then to portray human beings coming to grips with those problems. It's a commonplace that existentialism is more literary than philosophical, despite the fact that academic philosophy, in Percy's lifetime especially, often treated existentialism as a school of thought. It was one of the cages in the academic zoo of philosophy departments. Sartre, although also a philosopher, of course, and is often cited as a principal exponent of existentialism, labeled it an ideology rather than a philosophical theory, and others have agreed with him. Marjorie Green, for example, says that it has been characterized as a literary style rather than a form of philosophy, and this is a quote, not because it serves some higher school of thought, but because it is allegedly scarcely thought at all. It exclaims instead of arguing, rants instead of analyzing. That's the end of the quote. According to this criticism, if one wants to know what existentialism is, then read a novel rather than a philosophical work. So let's start right there. We here want to know, in discussing Walker Percy, how existentialism in literature tries and perhaps deserves to be called philosophical. So my purpose is to turn the wheel the other way. That's I'm taking a long time to state my goal, but that's what I want to talk about now. The Idiot of Dostoevsky follows the wayward path of Prince Myshkin, who returns to Russia after spending all his money on psychiatric treatment in Switzerland. He's penniless. He pays no attention when his fellow train passengers tease him for his absent-mindedness. He is instead looking for something, for an answer to a quest that he himself cannot formulate. Percy's early heroes and Prince Myshkin have a simplicity of spirit that is far from complacent, yet they often say things that associate themselves with empiricism, because they're actually looking at the everyday contents of their lives. They do believe in science. They believe in mathematics, engineering. These bodies of knowledge don't satisfy them, but they are the platform from which the search for a stronger, more coherent knowledge begins. The existential hero is not herself, but seeks something that will cure this condition, something of a specifically human quality. Given that the novelist, that Walker Percy, makes much of his main character's search and even of their sense of method in carrying out the search, it's tempting to ask whether we should attribute to them a distinctive philosophical view about not only what our goals should be as philosophers, but about how we should seek an understanding of the world. Is there an epistemology that's peculiar to their understanding of life? Could this have been what Socrates meant when he said, the unexamined life is not worth living? Or maybe a little more accurately, that such a life is no way of life at all. How does life need to be examined? Let's consider Percy's version of this epistemic challenge. He shows us how the world throws down the gauntlet to his characters. As only a literary laboratory can, his novels presume that whether to question things isn't a choice. We cannot say no to the puzzle of everydayness. We're forced to take so much for granted that the very phenomenon of taking things for granted becomes an issue. We are on a boat that, as Willard Van Ormond Quine once put it, we have to repair without a dry dock. What are we doing? Before Bix Bowling or Will Barrett begin to take their lives apart, so to speak, they're in a stable condition, but something's wrong with it. In Barrett's case, there have been a nagging series of breakdowns and an irrepressible and ill-defined unease in Bowling's conscious resignation to everyday life. Or take Lancelot Andrews Lamar in the novel named after him. He's a marginal lawyer who has committed murder, and that murder poses an after-the-fact mystery. We know it occurred from the very beginning and that he committed it. But it's a mystery because its forensic details are not declaratory of the real content of his act. There's an echo here of the breakdown of the ambitious life of the mod fashion photographer Thomas in Antonioni's Blow Up, which is, of course, based on the even more mysterious short story of the Argentine novelist Julio Cortázar. How does the mundane put these matter-of-fact people on a path that defies their necessary grounding in fact? One step up from the empiricism of common sense is that of professionals and experts. Percy's respectful mention of the skills of physicians, and especially of pathologists — he was a physician and a pathologist — is perhaps not a surprise, but then he injects this into his novels in a way that is rather surprising. He begins the Thanatos syndrome with a brief example of how the reasoning of professionals of this kind, of his type of professional, can be deeply instinctual. He tells us of a physician, quote, not a famous professor or even a very successful internist, but a natural diagnostician, who correctly suspected that one of his patients had bubonic plague in New Orleans after he had coincidentally observed the post-mortem symptoms of a rat in a neighbor's yard. The anecdote illustrates that a good diagnostician sees connections among things that might go unnoticed. And he takes this as proof of the fact that we really ought to concentrate on the things that don't attract attention, the things that lie in the off stage almost in our everyday life. This, of course, meshes beautifully with Percy's conviction that the most ordinary things in our lives hold clues to the understanding of what we need to know, to the solution of our crises, even when those crises belong to a completely different level of thought, like religion or culture or politics or the coherence of Western civilization. A common element in most, if not all, of Percy's bland seekers is their training as professionals, just as he was trained as a professional. And some of them are doctors as he was. One's a broker, one's a scientist, and one is a lawyer. They're qualified in their fields. They possess know-how. And for Percy, they evidently represent the lower reaches of the establishment, not quite pillars of society. He thinks of them as really rather humble beings on the social ladder. He nevertheless writes appreciatively of them, as if to tip his hat to their modest competence at what they do. And he juxtaposes their skill sets with the intuitive, inquisitive talents of his searching heroes, who usually aren't professionals. Some are, some aren't. Bill Barrett is an engineer, but only a phony one. Sutter Vaught and Dr. Tom Moore are discredited physicians. Lancelot Lamar is a lawyer, but he's in jail for committing murder. What is the link with the higher sort of inquiry and the examined life? It may seem far-fetched, but I want to suggest that these people are like the established politicians, businessmen, poets, and philosophers in the Socratic dialogues, fulsome in their self-assurance and completely baffled by Socrates' sniping at their presuppositions. Yet Socrates thinks that they are worthy interlocutors and at least superficially praises their accomplishments as professionals, just as Percy does. An interesting coincidence, but it may take us nowhere. Socrates questions philosophers on what are clearly matters of philosophical expertise. What is knowledge, for example? That's his main theme in the Theaetetus. He asks Ion, the bardic poet, about beauty and shows Meno, a small-town Thessalian businessman and slave owner, how we can learn things by showing that Meno's slave can construct a geometric proof without any training. Socrates ostensibly singles out professionals for questioning because they own their subject matter. This is perhaps an ironic posture on his part because he confesses his own ignorance of everything, and they don't. There's a parallel here again between Percy's professionals and his naive or innocent seekers. But it also seems part of his method to start by examining the obvious, and that is one of the things that professionals, well, are trained to do. Percy certainly takes for granted that this is what the medical, legal, other professional fields have taught us how to do. Barrett and Moore, two of his heroes, may wander from the grip of their analysis, that is, their psychoanalysis, but they never dismiss psychoanalysis as ineffectual or mistaken in theory. And typically Moore, in the Thanatos syndrome, he's himself a psychiatrist, treats his professional colleagues as serious students of the soul. He says so, although he does not entirely trust his own soul to their care. More significantly, he thinks of himself as still capable of finding truth for others through analysis, even though he is himself a recovering alcoholic and has spent 2 years in jail for selling drugs illegally. In addition to this almost superstitious respect for professional skill, Percy's characters treat their respective search projects, their seeking, their quests, no two are exactly alike, of course, as prospering even when the results of the search are bizarre. Will Barrett in The Last Gentleman watches the people and things through a high-powered telescope, using it as the means of finding salient details about the world. This is a short quote from the book. He clamped the telescope to the window jamb, selected a terrestrial eyepiece, and screwed it in place. He focused on a building clear across Central Park and beyond Fifth Avenue. There sprang into view a disk of brickwork, perhaps 8 feet in diameter. It was as he had hoped. Not only were the bricks seen as if they were 10 feet away, it was better than that. Every grain and crack and excrescence became available. Beyond any doubt, he said to himself, this proves that bricks, as well as other things, are not as accessible as they used to be. Special measures are needed to recover them. Finds mystery in anything. A more subtle feature of these investigations is the significance Percy's characters attach to conventional achievements and affirmations. I've already mentioned the strange episode of Bix Bowling's observation of Bill Holden as he gives a stranger a pat on the back. A more marked version of this same elevation of form over substance is Will Barrett's response to Sutter Vaught, that's a member of the family with whom he goes to live. Sutter Vaught is an agnostic, and when Sutter Vaught goes along with the baptism of his dying younger brother, Will Barrett finds that this is a kind of epiphany. Sutter had not agreed that the religious ceremony had the meaning believers attribute to it, and Will knows this. But all the same, he considers this acquiescence, sufficient as a climax. Stendhal's Julien Sorel observes that when he was a seminarian, there was a piety even in the way one ate an egg. He says this sardonically, but so does Will Barrett have a sort of sardonic respect for form, for going along with form. Perhaps we are to understand Percy's attitude towards these performances precisely as a recognition that performance is often all that is required to make something true. To say, I take you for my wedded husband or wife, is not only to do what the words describe, but to make it happen. Philosophers in the linguistic tradition call these performative utterances and note that they may be self-verifying. And this seems to be one of Percy's obsessions. There is, however, another type of event that also has significance, apparently like that of these culminating performative events. These may be described as moments of sensuous fulfillment. They include Barrett's crossing the Mississippi on a small boat from Vicksburg to the mythically misplaced Cutoff, Louisiana, which is actually in Lafourche Parish, which he misnames Shutoff in the novel, as he goes to find Jamie and Sutter, knowing that Jamie is dying and they're way out west somewhere. But just crossing the Mississippi is a sort of epiphany for him. The boat was one that Will and his father had taken out on the White River in the 50s. He says, this is another quote, "It was a sparkling day. The river was ruffled by glittering steel wavelets like a northern lake. Shoving off and sitting buttoned up kayak style in the aft hole, he was dropping away in the fast water, past the barrow pits and blue holes, and now beginning to paddle, went skimming over the wide river, which seemed to brim and curve up like a watch glass from the great creamy boils that shed tons of cold bottom water, down past old Fort Ste. Marie on the Louisiana side, its ramparts gone back to blackberries and honeysuckle." Even though Barrett, this is the end of the quote, even though Barrett will struggle to find Jamie and have to convince Sutter to allow him to be baptized, this crossing is placed in the midst of his quest as if it signaled a victory yet to come and had conferred on Barrett the reward of that victory already. The passage exemplifies Percy's poetic gift, which he rarely indulges. When he does let it do the work of the narrative, it reminds the reader of Huckleberry Finn's Days on the Mississippi, or perhaps of Faulkner's Bear. But it's a special kind of performance. When Percy shifted gears in later novels, he no longer made his central character a bystander to everydayness. Instead, for example, the lawyer in Lancelot, for whom the book is named, is the sensual and degenerate antagonist to a protagonist called Percival, the representative of angelic knowledge. Percy is, of course, an abbreviation of Percival, also of Parsifal, the wounded innocent in the opera of that name, who alone can find the Holy Grail. I'm going to come back to the name dropping in a moment. I know this sounds extreme. Dr. Tom Moore in Love in the Ruins and the Thanatos Syndrome is another flawed investigator, although in both books the focus of his investigation is a global crisis as well as one that concerns him directly. He finds that his beloved profession of psychiatry enables others to threaten civilization itself. So the sensual plays a constant role in Percy's delineation of existential quests, notably in The Last Gentleman, The Second Coming, and Lancelot. As Barrett says, that's Barrett's own, itch for omniscience is a yearning for both angelic knowledge and carnal knowledge. Binks, Barrett, and Moore all agree that love is central to their quest. They make no pronouncements about the reason for this, but there is no doubt that they considered sexual fulfillment to be decisive in some way. Having found Kitty, his girlfriend, his fiancée in The Last Gentleman, quote, "the solitary girl on the park bench, as inward and watchful as he, who might wander with him through old green Louisiana," close quote. This apparently liberates Barrett to do his best as Jamie's protector and caregiver to the Vaught family and to find what he's looking for. In the Thanatos Syndrome, the coolness of Moore's wife, Ellen, after his return from prison, becomes the main reference point for his need to complete the medical research that will prove his worth. It's a fairly crazy medical piece of research, but nevertheless, this is his mission. God and religion stand both at the edge and at the center of Percy's theater of doubt. This is, of course, fittingly bifocal. I'm thinking back to what I said earlier about all of us being bifocal. But he introduces spiritual problems and solutions very indirectly, often through observations of historical decay, as rough-hewn and unsatisfactory characters reflect on that decay. He saw, and often more or less directly affirmed, that the Holocaust and the moral disintegration of Germany that owned this unspeakable outcome were irreparable failures that marred all subsequent life and thought, not just in Germany, but everywhere. Dr. Tom Moore, in 2 novels, made it clear that the decline not only of the West, but of all civilization were unambiguous evidence of a human epidemic, a defining and pervasive virus in the human condition. But that does not make it unambiguous. It is like the wound of Parsifal, the innocent who gets caught up in the search for the Holy Grail without knowing why. Many of Percy's characters are reincarnations of that innocent figure, and I cannot escape thinking that so was Percy himself. I'm shifting gears here now a little myself because I want to bring in some of the other themes that he lets crowd the foreground for us to think through, and that's really what I'm describing, is his presentation to us as the readers of the primary subject matter of his main characters, the things that they are thinking about. Politics, economics, and racial relations have a marked effect on Percy's searching characters. He describes the mixed signals that dominate conversations between the races, especially in the South, and stands back from the presumption that all can be put right by mere legislation or a change in the tone of majoritarian culture. Antonio Gramsci once used the term hegemony to describe the pervasive falseness of dominant culture's influence on the lives and even the thought of those who have no choice but to live in it. Percy shows us how this plays out in very specific settings, not as an add-on to his narrative, but as a key ingredient. In the later novels, broader politics and its strange or tragic products are central to the problems of genuineness that his characters face. To bring Percy's religious and existential interests to the fore, it helps to recount the rivalry of the Vaughts siblings in The Last Gentleman, and this will be my one retelling of a significant part of one of the novels, but I think it's, and I offer this as a symptomatic example of what he shows us when he brings the characters into, well, some sort of interaction with each other. Two of the siblings, these are, Will Barrett had joined up with a family and followed them halfway across the country. Two of the siblings, Sutter and Val, strong characters with conspicuous flaws, come to dominate Will's understanding of his situation. Will had fallen in love with Kitty Vaught, their sister, as he surveyed Central Park through his telescope. Eventually, through Kitty, he met her parents and her brother Jamie. Jamie was dying of a not perfectly identified disease. Vaught Sr. essentially offered Will a job of sorts as Jamie's caretaker. It isn't clear to Will at first why, but by the time he has taken up residence with the Vaught's, it's apparent that Will was brought in as a trusted, neutral party. Why was one needed? Slowly it becomes obvious that Sutter and Val are in contention for Jamie's allegiance. Sutter is a doctor, a pathologist like Percy, whose hospital has disciplined him for taking humane but unconventional steps for the psychological good of his patients. He's also estranged from his wife Anita, who still lives with the Vaught's as a family member and takes a disenchanted view of much that goes on in the family. Despite all this, Will's encounter with Sutter convinces him that Sutter has answers to Will's search, and he goes directly to him and asks for those answers. But when they meet alone and he gets the opportunity to ask for these answers, Sutter is sarcastic and refuses to acknowledge that he has anything of value to say to Will. Soon after, Will has a similar unsatisfying encounter with Val, who is alienated from the family, perhaps because she's an unconventional Catholic nun. By the way, she's also a Catholic nun without a convent. She's a sort of Parsifal of a nun. She speaks of religious matters with no apparent fervor, as if she scorns piety and has no tolerance for reflection on her religious beliefs. She does, however, press Will to make sure that Jamie is baptized before he dies. So Will's two long conversations, first with Sutter and then with Val, are the turning point of the novel. He's deeply moved by them. He later reads selections from Sutter's diary, carelessly or maybe deliberately left for him to find. He nevertheless attaches the greatest significance to Sutter's sharply critical but cynical comments, and they're really almost laughably not good comments, but they're polar in a way for Will's own search. He finds them significant. They're polar with the comments and experiences that he's had with Val. Percy very strategically leaves it to the reader to puzzle over Will's thoughts, to really have those thoughts for him. Stepping out of the frame for a moment, let me compare this with Mitya, Vanya, and Alyosha, the brothers Karamazov, in the novel of that name. They have a similar relationship, except that it's the religious Alyosha who meditates on the anguish and defective reasoning of the other two. What does such a comparison of idiosyncratic views do for the search of the hero, for Will or Alyosha? The reader may well be confused by the novelist's strategy. For a very private person, Percy himself publicly became a convert to Catholicism. One might almost say that he flaunted this. Yet he did so without discussing the content of his religious belief. The same is true of the majority of his protagonists. Why are they not specific about the discovery that resolves their searches? A first hypothesis might be that, for them, conversion is just a private matter, despite the entanglement with the world of their progress towards that goal. But I think the novels make the reason much more concrete. So much is at stake, and so much is resolved by this outcome for these characters, that to say anything brief or summarizing about it would be to falsify its content. For the type of search Percy portrays in his writings, and it isn't always a religious search, sometimes it's purely cultural or historical, no resolution can be reduced to a creed. To present it in that way would be to make it seem a stopping point, something too passive even to count as a resolution. It would be, as the existentialists say, inauthentic. The novels are the argument that makes this conclusion, which might be described also as no conclusion, inevitable. I have saved for last one of the most conspicuous, and this is going to be a little more relaxing, I hope, one of the more conspicuous and sometimes jarring features of Percy's narratives. He's a name dropper. Overlying the careful plotting of these heuristic narratives, there is an obtrusive flotsam and jetsam of allusions to literature or history, as well as to atmospheric clues, the Louisiana family and town names and other place names, all of which he peppers his narratives with. They beg to be understood as pieces in a puzzle. Percy had, as we all know, a peculiar fetish for Louisiana place names. I've mentioned his liking for cut off, or shut off, as he calls it in Lafourche Parish. He also loved to have Binks and Will and Dr. Tom Moore affectionately refer to the Feliciana parishes. This comes up all the time. He once uses the name of Hammond, the town, in a trick question he poses to his fellow shrinks in the Thanatos syndrome. Family names like Catrier in the Moviegoer must also have appealed strongly to him because he harps on them. They, of course, have another function, that of giving the novels a stronger taste of home than virtually any other fiction written in or about Louisiana. So that's one of his name-dropping strategies. Here's another. Dr. Tom Moore is said in the novel to be a descendant of St. Thomas More, and that's a big name to drop. This is, however, not straightforwardly a good thing. The earlier More was a professional lawyer who helped the common law improve itself by borrowing from Roman law, and who wrote a modern answer to Plato's Republic, but who also found himself compromised by his service to Henry VIII. The man for all seasons was a very well-seasoned veteran of troubling, if not corrupt, politics. And that comes out in Percy's novel. Lancelot, in the novel named after him, his middle name is Andrews. Well, Lancelot Andrews was another politically central religious figure. He was the Bishop of Ely in Winchester in England, and he wrote tracts defending the divine right of kings. He wrote them for King James, as a matter of fact, and he's celebrated by T.S. Eliot in an essay about his writings. Although Eliot, in writing about him, suggests that his spirituality had a strangely dark side. So these are tidbits that flow into the novel as a kind of clue about what's going on. He's constantly dropping names that have a little resonance to them. Many of the dropped names appear fleetingly. Jamie in The Last Gentleman, having read Wittgenstein's Tractatus, quotes the last words, whereof one cannot speak, thereof must one remain silent. Given that the Tractatus is a landmark work in logical atomism, reducing the world to an exhaustive list of true propositions, that is its goal, that is its argument. The suggestion here in this book, in The Last Gentleman, that there may be more to the world than that, is surprisingly candid and perhaps tragic admission on Wittgenstein's own part. And I've never seen it used in that way before. It's as if Percy was saying, Wittgenstein discredited his own conclusions by pointing out that we can't speak about it, but there is something more. It fits in well with Jamie's and Will's scrutiny of the scraps out of which their lives are made. Similarly, it's mentioned repeatedly that Will is reading a book called The Theory of Large Numbers. As far as I know, there is no classic work by this name, but the reference is presumably to Poisson's law of large numbers, the basic premise of classical statistical inference. Why is that relevant? Well, it's because he honors as it were, the inductive approach, the taking one thing after another and building it into a pattern. As part of the introduction of Jamie Vaught in the novel, Anita, that is the estranged wife of Sutter, she compares him, by the way, to my charming ex-husband, and it's entirely sarcastic. Anita says that Jamie's high school math teacher threw him out of class for wanting to argue about John von Neumann's theory of games. This is the classic work that invented game theory. It's a throwaway line, but why is it thrown away? Why are we getting this? Percy's talking to the audience, right? This is not the characters really talking to each other. He's poking us in the ribs. Others of these references are just jokes. Sutter Vaught, a flawed but sort of heroic figure, at least in Will's view, asks Will, do you know who did the West in? Western civilization? And he answers his own question. It wasn't Marx or immorality or the communists or the atheists or any of those. It was Leigh Hunt. Who the hell is it? Now this has got to be Percy's joke, for although Sutter, who's often serious and frivolous at the same time, he's often really way off base. He probably meant it literally, or maybe he did. Leigh Hunt was, of course, the character on whom Dickens based the famous pseudo-juvenile Harold Skimpole in Bleak House. I don't know if you remember this, but Mr. Jarndyce invites Harold Skimpole over for dinner, and Skimpole hangs around for quite a long time. He's the guest who always exclaims repeatedly, "I am but a child," and then raves on tendentiously about art and literature, blessing his own views with his self-proclaimed innocence. In fact, Leigh Hunt was a mild essayist with a flair for publicity. Dickens no doubt knew him as a simplifier of great literature, for in books like his Stories from the Italian Poets, he makes them smaller than they are, proclaiming judgments on their lives and accomplishments with no authority to back this up. When Sutter blames Leigh Hunt for doing the West End, we're surely supposed to think Sutter himself is overthinking what might be a fairly valid criticism of Hunt's career. He's a trivializer. That's what Leigh Hunt was. Do you have to know that in order to read this book? I'm a fan of Leigh Hunt, actually, so that's why I picked it up. Percy also name drops in a sense which makes boundary-leaping cross-references between the novels. Sometimes the novels refer to each other in this way. For example, Will cannot understand why a stranger, in The Last Gentleman, refers to him, addresses him as Merle, and it never comes up again. But Merle is a character in the Moviegoer. And so this is Scotch tape, I suppose, tying the literature together. A nameless reference also makes repeated appearances. It's another connection among the characters in several of the books. Their hallucination, this is the reference, they have a hallucination of ravenous or ravening and sometimes singing particles showering upon them. Will mentions them several times, but so does Binks. Binks has the same experience, so does Dr. Tom Moore. There's no straightforward psychological explanation for this symptom they share, I don't think, although it may indeed be one that crops up in psychotherapists' work. I haven't been able to run that to ground. But there's a more obvious explanation. The rain of particles is also an allusion, I think, to Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. This is one of the great works of the golden age of Latin poetry. It's primarily an exposition of the doctrine of atomism, the view that everything that exists consists of physical particles that randomly collide and form physical things, including ourselves, animals, and tables and chairs, and it accounts for mind as well as for the solidity of those tables and chairs. It was an outstanding atheistic work of classical times, more radical in its exposition, in its express conclusions, than the fragmentary works of earlier atomists that have come down to us. And it seems to be something that bugs Percy deeply. I'll mention just one more stray allusion to emphasize that Will, though suffering from fugue states and other psychological symptoms, is not a pathological or foolhardy inquirer. Percy applies the epithet sentient approximately 15 times to him, with an awkwardness that recalls Homeric formulaic epithets. It turns out that Coleridge used the term sentient with a similar meaning in the Biographia Literaria, where he expounds how the capacity for knowledge is definitional of the type of existence that we have, that human beings have. So by sentient, he doesn't really mean just having senses, but actually being capable of knowledge of ourselves. And so it's an illusion that goes unexplained. References like these are tantalizing and so numerous that no one but a doctoral student could gather and annotate them all, and I'm not intending to. As I've already suggested, though, these name-dropping references give the novels a kind of girdle of reference that builds an involuntary urgency to the quests of the central characters. You get the feeling that we, like them, are pushed along by this surrounding cultural background. It does more than this. Many of the references create boundaries to the existential paralysis of the main character. When a reference is overtly approving, as in the case of the reference to the Tractatus of Wittgenstein, the message is that this work is to be respected, if only as a hint for the search, or as a solid feature of the landscape in which the search is to be carried out. Just as Percy consistently treats professionals with respect and thereby tells us that their expertise, although it may not go far enough, is neither false nor irrelevant, so too do these references to medicine, mathematics, engineering, and law tell us that these learned and skilled professions are not inherently misleading. They only can't give us the whole truth. Indeed, they prove in every instance to contain clues that further the search for something more angelic, some more angelic knowledge. Let me now stand back from these details for a moment. How does the whole of Percy's oeuvre represent a philosophical enterprise? My view concerning especially the first two novels is that each plausibly allows the reader to see the quest for angelic knowledge, as it's called there, from the point of view of the seeker, from the point of view of that character, defective and incapable as the character may be. I think this is an impressive accomplishment, and I think we all see this as we read these books. We are actually on the conveyor belt that he has created, which is structured around what these characters are seeing and what they're experiencing. It's an impressive achievement that, in my view, gives Percy a distinct place in the small pantheon of really philosophical artists. It's even more striking that his highly original strategy in these novels is a plausible guide sometimes for lost souls, even when the going is fairly tough. The other novels also use this strategy, though in a less open-ended way and maybe a little less consistency. Perhaps he had decided, I've done it enough, and then went on to a slightly different version. And I won't really bother to try to classify these more limited versions, but it's interesting to see that Dr. Moore, who's in two of the novels, says of a group of patients and fellow prisoners, he's been in jail, these people who are seemingly unrelated to each other, that they had a certain curious disinterest, he says, a sameness here, a flatness of affect. Words that could well have been applied to Banks, the lover of blandness, or to Will, who looked through his telescope at the cracks and excrescences in the brick wall. In Lancelot, the eponymous anti-hero is a psychotic killer driven to murder, perhaps by that same flatness and sameness, because he certainly talks about it. My conclusion is that Walker Percy at least succeeds in putting himself into the category of the literary philosopher, the literary existentialist. In order to succeed, he had to invent or reinvent the philosophical novel. His plan of action was to show us several ways along the path to overcoming the itch for omniscience, the bifocal awareness out of which everydayness is constructed and revealed to be only a signpost. He did this with the utmost care, recognizing the pitfalls of inauthenticity, cautiously showing us the dots we have to connect for ourselves, and implicitly making the reader the protagonist of the novels. Thank you.
Would anyone like to ask Dr. Foots a question or make any comments on his work?
Well, I have one. Why does the search only come to Southern aristocrats and professionals? You know, why doesn't it come to a janitor or a house custodian?
Well, that's a good question, and I mean, like the question, why does it come primarily to professionals? The easy answer is that this is what Percy knew. And he's scrupulously careful in his description of characters to, as it were, detail their personalities as he knew them in real life. And he's a very good realist in this regard. But I would say that just as he gives perhaps more attention to some historical and religious phenomena than he does to others, well, you know, he's biased. He's not impartial. I don't think he thinks that his seekers can be impartial. He can't really consider all the alternatives. But I have no idea what he would have said. Do you think?
Maybe God's a Southern gentleman.
Oh, that's it.
Well, actually, it was because when both parents committed suicide and they went to live with their cousin Will, Will was an icon of the whole South. He had 20,000 acres of cotton.
Right.
He was educated at Yale. He was a poet. They met. It was a tremendously narrow world. He went from there to Chapel Hill, which is again a narrow world.
Mm-hmm.
Medicine. I mean, he was a good friend of mine.
Ah.
And he knew that he didn't know how normal people lived. No, he said that. I don't
That's great.
know.
It's good to
The
know.
reason none of my main characters have jobs, really, well, the doctors, is because I have never worked in my life. And I don't know what it is to have the pressures of a job and all that. But anyway.
But without offense, he seems to think that the kingdom of God only comes by invitation to the professionals, the Southern gentlemen. There's something terribly snobbish and exclusive, and in a sense wipes out what I think every great Catholic novelist has always had, a sense of cosmic evil.
Mm-hmm.
He puts all the responsibility on man and none of the responsibility on God.
Don't you think the suicide, 3 suicides?
What?
3 suicides in his family might have been the reason for that?
Well, it might be, but it flaws his work, doesn't it? You know, his
Well,
art just.
I'm not gonna say anything more because he was one of my closest friends, and we had many, many great conversations, so I'm really not. I mean, because I'm too close to him.
I'm curious as to what you think is the progression
In the
his
novels?
You mentioned, I know of his great interest in and reading in existentialism.
Mm.
And it seems to me, as a novelist, the first 3 novels are the most interesting. Because I think those, once you get to Love in the Ruins and Thomas More, I begin to see him changing.
Oh,
Because I think in the
definitely,
first 2, he is the existentialist. He's
Yeah.
looking, it's why he's looking. Existentialism, it seems to me, is posited on the belief that there is no God and we find our own way. And I think it developed a lot in Europe after World War II and the Nazi experience. And some of the inscriptions in the camps, if there is a God, he has to answer to me. He has to apologize to me. And I think his emphasis on looking at things, everything carefully,
Yes.
because that's the way we learn if we don't have a guide. If we've said God is dead and there is no guide for us, we have to find one of our own. And I think that's what happens. I think Percy's such a good writer that at the end of Love in the Ruins, you have Thomas More out in this gorgeous, lush setting,
Yeah.
talking about the lordly Gaspergoo, and beautiful. And I think he's depending on his writing, to carry a certain message that he's not sure of. And I think by the time you get to Lancelot, which I found to be a novel almost impossible to read, and then you get to Thanatos, where he is really condemning the whole idea that psychiatry can give us answers. It seems to me, that's my reading of it. But so that he needs some answer that he can only find, I think, in religion. He's by the time he's finished that novel, it seems to me he's said that existentialism is empty. We need something other than what we can see and what we can try to explain in the human experience. And I think from his biography, I think it's Patrick Samway's book, or it may be another article I read. He had 2 daughters, one of whom was had I don't know what her problem, it was a mental problem or something.
She was dead.
And she's complaining about it, and he is trying to convince her not to give up on God, not to lose her faith. Because I found Percy as a novelist, what you say, very philosophical, has interest in, I think, his early readings in existential philosophers, and then his conversion to the Catholic Church. Sometimes it seems to me he has the real fervor of the convert. He
does.
I think in many ways he's more Catholic than most born Catholics. He came to it and believed it. And
He often refers to the unseriousness of Catholics.
yeah. But I think he's a serious.
He's a serious one.
I think he's a serious Catholic. And I think the satisfying as literary works than the first three.
I have a suggestion to make, and I have no idea whether this works, really. I mean, I'm not sure quite how I would test it, but one of the themes of existentialism, not only of his, I think it is in his works, but in really all of the big existential novelists, is the problem of theodicy. Can there be a God if we have a world in which there are inexplicable evils that aren't human beings' fault, that are the fault of the creator, if there's a creator? You know who spends a great deal of time on this in a little chapter that's now excerpted and taught in philosophy courses? Dostoevsky. It's right in the middle of the Brothers Karamazov. There's this long chapter on theodicy. And it's actually a tract. It's really not part of the story. It's, let's break loose and talk about this. And I think theodicy is the problem in the Thanatos syndrome. I'm not quite sure that I have a way of presenting that. I mean, I don't think I could spell my thesis out for Lancelot. I find that a not very satisfying book in telling us where he's going. But I think in the Thanatos syndrome, he starts out by really building a case for the seriousness, if not perfection, of the psychiatric profession. I mean, he really does. He gives lots of examples. He shows psychiatrists interacting with each other. There are puzzles that they solve very effectively, and he's on the path, he hopes, that is the main character, Dr. Tom Moore, is on the path to really finding a serious new solution to a problem. And then, as you know, at the end of the book, he finds out through Father Smith's confession that some of the most important child psychiatrists in Germany, who had been leaders of the profession, they'd been influential on the profession in the States and in other parts of the world, actively participated in, well, they probably thought of it as euthanasia, but they were just killing children. And they were killing them systematically and regularly. And he says in so many words that is, well, I can't remember if it's the authors saying this or if it's Tom Moore saying it, but they're the same, more or less. It's worse that it was the psychiatrists who were doing it than it was for these street thugs who were out murdering, you know, Jews and gypsies and so on. The psychiatrists they're the doctors of the soul. So I mean, it's I think a very bold theodicy problem, and I think that's why the book ends in despair. Sort of. I mean, there's not much you can say after that. I don't think he meant that to be the final word, but it's certainly it's an emphatic statement of the problem. I mean, that's just one way of taking it.
I'm curious about in choosing to address what you did in tonight's lecture. Your piece is so far-ranging across this whole body of work, but conspicuously absent is the second coming from our discussions, and it's almost as though he only wrote all these novels minus one.
Yeah,
and I'm
you got me.
Well, I'm only asking because I'm wondering if there's a reason why it seems like that piece, as the follow-up to Will Barrett's life, might really be an interesting consideration as he comes to sort of the conclusion of his questing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it belongs to the later ones, to the later novel. Well, it is a later novel.
Right.
It's not. It doesn't immediately follow this one. Its strategy is different. It's some of the ingredients, though, of course, are shared. And I frankly found when I began to try to talk about it that it was confusing even to me to include it. And so I apologize. I did sort of hope you wouldn't notice. I was trying to get away without really giving an account of it, but you're absolutely right.
I just was wondering if this, you know, I hear, of course, people debate frequently the quality of his writing in Lancelot and in the Thanatos syndrome. But I was wondering how you feel the Second Coming fits into that evolution of his work. I mean, people often say what you just said a moment ago. They find his early works much more satisfying, and I wonder if you thought the same about the Second Coming. If it's also not as satisfying as those early ones.
I find him fascinating in really every book. I will say that I can see that there's some real difference in his command as a writer in the later books. And the earlier books are very heavily, carefully edited. I think in the case of the Moviegoer, I think it was heavily edited by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, but also by himself. And he really refined this up to a point. And then it seems to me that I think he may have felt that was getting in the way. And I mean, it's other novelists do the same thing. It's like Nabokov, is really refined in some of the novels, and then in some of the novels he is more fluent. And I find the later Percy novels, I would say, more fluent, a little less careful, but not. I mean, of course, he's a magnificent writer. He's not messing up, but there's a dropping off in some of this setting of the stage and showing you what the hero is seeing from the inside. I know that I can't really capture that very well in a summary, in a short summary, but it is, I think, true, and it's an interesting accomplishment that better than other existentialist novelists, he shows you the pieces that he thinks his character found significant, and he leaves it up to you to figure out why. I mean, I think Dostoevsky is probably the most important existentialist to compare him with. And one of the things about Dostoevsky is that whenever you get to one of these gripping crisis moments, he just slams the door in your face. He doesn't tell you what's going on. I mean, you go from one chapter to the next, and it's as if someone had put crashing cymbals in your ears, and you just don't know what to think next. And I mean, Percy is really the opposite of that. It's not so much that I think he's solicitous of the reader. It's that precisely what he's doing is to show you how things take place. And I think he does it in the later novels as well as the earlier ones. It's maybe not quite as conspicuous in them.
Actually, that was his favorite novel.
The Second Coming?
Second Coming.
Well, I have to go back and rewrite this then.
No, but what he said was,
Yeah.
for the first time, he actually knew what to do with his main character.
Aha.
He said at the end of the Moviegoer, Binks marries Kate, but so what? At the end of Love in the Ruins, Thomas More is sitting on the bank of the bayou with a voluptuous Presbyterian wife, which is fine, but again, so what? As for Lance, he goes off to Virginia to the barn, and he said, but I really knew what to do with this guy. He gets the girl, he works, he helps other people work, and he said at the end of The Last Gentleman, Will is chasing Sutter to find out what Sutter knows. And I asked him, I said, what did Sutter know? He said, if I knew, put it in.
But that is, again, that's a whole lot like Dostoevsky. And I mean, I think what it means is, what it is as an experience for the reader, it's a challenge. I mean, it's fine if he doesn't know. I mean, he wouldn't want us to know anyway. That's not what he's doing. If he were just going to spit out the conclusion,
Right, exactly.
That would be an essay on man, which is a nice thing, but it's not showing you the method, or it's not showing you the experience.
I think he just really enjoyed writing a book that
Turned out nicely.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a very good point. I mean, it shouldn't be the case that everything has to be extreme and strained, and it more or less was impossible in the first two novels to escape that quality, and in part because of what he's showing us. It's strained because he's putting these complex, questionable things before our minds without telling us why.
Yeah.
I think they're challenging books. I'm not, and the existentialist novel has now kind of gone away. We really don't get it anymore. I think that for a while it had its own special connection with our time, and well, he himself said in his Paris Review interview, I used to think of myself as an existentialist, and I don't anymore. I don't remember when that was. I think it was fairly late in his life, but let me say, what I've tried to say in this paper is give a reason for us to think of him as qualifying as a literary philosopher, as a person who's using something like doing philosophy, so to speak, in literature. I'm convinced that he's the legitimate item. He really is that. There's, of course, a huge amount about him that I don't know, and there's quite a lot that I've pondered over, but I don't understand. The things I don't get. Not really sure why I'm not sure what the message of the climactic scenes in several of the books really is. I know that we're supposed to think about it. You know, it's a climax of it we're supposed to try to understand.
Any other questions?